Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at questions of development in global politics. This video deals specifically with the economic legacy of colonialism as they affect post-colonial development. So let's get started. It's difficult to understate the impact of colonialism on the development of local economies in the global south. This graph traces the proportion of global gross domestic product, dividing it into that produced in the developed countries of the global north in blue, and the proportion produced in the developing countries of the global south in yellow. In the year 1500, the countries comprising today's developing economies were responsible for nearly 80% of all global economic activity. But as colonialism progressed, that proportion declined. Developed countries, primarily the colonial powers, claimed to a larger and larger share of world economic activity. We can also think of it in terms of economic activities of individual countries. In the year 1700, China and India together were responsible for about half of all global economic activity. Europe, by contrast, was responsible for less than a quarter. By the early 1950s, Chinese and Indian share of the global economic activity had declined to less than 10%, while Europe's activity, despite the impact of World War II, had risen to almost one-third. These trends were the combined result of industrialization in the global north, which depended in part on the primary commodities produced by the global south, as well as on conscious efforts to undermine economic activity in the global south itself. More specifically, colonialism restructured economic activity in the colonies in several important ways. First, domestic industries were often undermined or destroyed to make the colony more dependent on the export of manufactured goods from the colonizer. In order to compete with Indian textile manufacturers, the British government imposed steep tariffs on Indian exports, eventually banning them altogether. When that failed, British soldiers in India were ordered to smash Indian looms and to cut off the thumbs of Indian weavers to prevent them from producing cloth that might compete with the lower quality British textiles. It's hardly surprising then that Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance to British colonial rule centered in part on spinning cloth and producing his own clothing. Second, colonial policies often restructured control over land. Colonial policy generally resulted in the confiscation of land and its gifting to colonial settlers and businesses. Land grants usually resulted in the dislocation of the indigenous communities who had historically resided on and farmed that land. Some were transformed into tenant farmers who were now required to pay rent to the land's new owner, but most were just expelled from the land and forced to move to less productive and more environmentally unsustainable regions. And in any case, they were generally not granted ownership rights or title, meaning that their status was always precarious. Not surprisingly, the land question would become one of the most important questions faced by all post-colonial governments in their effort to achieve economic development and to overcome the colonial legacy. And finally, colonial policies restructured production to emphasize the production of primary commodities and raw material inputs for industry. Before colonization, economies in the global south were generally diverse and varied, and economic activity was geared towards the maintenance of the local community. After colonization, economies were restructured to focus on the production of basic commodities for global markets. Colonies, particularly in the era of industrial colonialism, were supposed to provide the raw materials necessary to support industrialization in the colonizing country. This economic dependence on primary commodity production was particularly pernicious. Following decolonization, post-colonial economies were frequently structured around the export of a single primary commodity. This primary commodity dependence carried over into the post-colonial economy. Indeed, even today, many developing countries remain highly dependent on a single primary commodity for the bulk of their export earnings. This map illustrates the scope of primary commodity dependence in the developing world. Countries in dark green, for example, earn 80% or more of their export earnings from oil. Similarly, countries in orange are dependent on agricultural commodities like cotton or tobacco or bananas or fishing for the majority of their export earnings. This is particularly problematic because the value of primary commodities tends to be less stable and to decline relative to the value of manufactured goods over time. This trend is known as the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. The Prebisch-Singer hypothesis captured a general trend in the price of commodities, particularly in the post-World War II development era. As the graph here illustrates, the relative prices for tropical and non-tropical agricultural commodities, as well as for minerals, has generally declined over the long term despite sharp fluctuation in prices over the short term. Even setting aside the sharp oil spike prices associated with the 1973 and 1979 oil prices, the real prices adjusted for inflation of primary commodities have declined by over 40% from the 1970s onward. And this aligns with what the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis suggests would happen, that over time, the relative prices of primary commodities would tend to decline. But why is that the case? There's a couple of possible explanations. The first rests with the idea that's known as the elasticity of demand. Put simply, elasticity of demand refers to the degree to which demand for a product changes relative to changes in price of that product. When demand for a product is relatively elastic, reductions in the price of the commodity can often yield increases in demand that offset the decline in a per unit price. In this example of elastic demand, reducing the price of a commodity by 25 cents leads to an increase in demand for that product by 6 units. While we may earn less per unit sold, the total income increases from $3, 3 units at $1 each, to $6.75, 9 units at 75 cents a unit. But when demand is relatively inelastic, increased demand may not offset the loss per unit sold. Here we see an example of a commodity with relatively inelastic demand. Note that reducing the price of the commodity from $2 to $1 per unit generates only an increase in demand for 2 units. As a result, total income decreases as price goes down. The question, of course, is the degree to which demand for particular commodities may be elastic or inelastic. There's good reason to believe that demand for many primary commodities is relatively inelastic. I'm unlikely to consume significantly more bananas if the price of a banana declines sharply, for example. There may be other reasons beyond demand elasticity that explains why primary commodity prices might decline over time. In addition to the elasticity of demand, the price of primary commodities relative to the price of manufactured goods may also decline because of the substitutability of primary commodities. Greater efficiency in manufacturing processes has tended to reduce both the quantity of primary commodity used and created substitutes for some of those commodities. Cars produced today, for example, use considerably less steel than they did 20 years ago, both because we use the materials more efficiently and because we have substituted other commodities like plastic for steel. There may also be fewer opportunities for product development in primary commodities than in manufactured goods. There are other reasons to be concerned with the primary commodity dependence experienced by many developing countries. We know that primary commodity dependence is negatively correlated with economic growth, as this graph demonstrates. That is to say, economies which are highly dependent on a primary commodity or resource exports tend to grow more slowly than economies which are less dependent on resource exports. This seems to run counter to the example provided by countries like Qatar, or to a common sense understanding of development that suggests that, say, oil-rich countries might be better positioned to develop. But remember that while a handful of countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates have been able to translate natural resource endowments into broader economic development, many others, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, have suffered from resource-fueled civil wars, leading to widespread discussion of a resource curse. This suggests that resource wealth may actually undermine economic development. Further, in many postcolonial economies, resource production and wealth is still concentrated in the hands of foreign corporations, and economic ties between former colonies and their former colonial power remain even after independence. Indeed, many postcolonial economies continue to have former colonizers as their primary trading partners, suggesting little real change in economic structures. Finally, many postcolonial states suffer from severe inequality, which is a carryover from colonialism as well. So that concludes our very brief overview of the economic legacy of colonialism. I hope you found it informative. Please leave your thoughts in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.